a joint operational team meeting. And in those JOTs, we will have a team leader from the security service and a senior investigating officer from the police. And we work together to share intelligence and information and assess the threat, harm and risk from that intelligence or information.
So do MI5 chair that meeting?
They do, yes.
But it's attended by counter-terrorism police. That's
Correct.
the joint operational team meeting.
Yes.
You described it as if it's 2 people, but I imagine it may sometimes be more than that.
It's substantially more than that, sir. So we tend to have experts from both our teams that then can help inform the assessment of the threat we see in that meeting.
Right.
And you refer in your statement to executive liaison group meetings. Is that another form of meeting that is for the purpose of liaison between the intelligence service of MI5 and CTP?
Yes, it is. So when there's a particularly challenging investigation or a high-risk investigation, or one that is likely to have a significant national or international impact, we can have something called an executive liaison group, an ELG. And that is a strategic level meeting chaired by the senior national coordinator for counterterrorism. And through that meeting, they can provide oversight of the public safety risks, the threat, harm and risk, and monitor the investigation both from MI5 and policing's perspective. Very much a partnership meeting, again, with different attendees, sometimes from government, but mostly from the intelligence community and policing to respond to those incidents.
So 2 types of meetings, but that one's chaired by the Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing.
Yes.
Whereas the JOT is chaired by MI5.
Correct.
And does the JOT develop the ELG strategy?
It does, yes.
You've mentioned the difference between counter-terrorism police investigations and other investigations, and you've referred to counter-state threat investigations. Are those generally more complex than counter-terrorism investigations, the counter-state threat?
So they're more complex in how you handle information and you make decisions. But otherwise, the structures are very similar for how we operate. It's really who's entitled to see that information and what that information means to us in decision-making terms.
So one of the things is the need-to-know principle being
Absolutely.
applied in terms of handling information. And is that because of the enhanced capability and resources of states?
It is, absolutely. And in this case, when you're investigating terrorism, it's pretty unlikely that those terrorists will have capability to do some things that we know some states have to do to us as a country. So as a result, we have a very much more restricted sharing of intelligence in those investigations.
And you make the point in your witness statement that whereas there might not generally be the sort of general mass casualty you might see in a counter-terrorism situation, the compromise of information or sources might cause damage to national security that could lead to a loss of life.
Yes, that's correct. We have seen incidents that do, of course, directly lead to loss of life from state threat investigations in a similar way to counter-terrorism, but equally, the compromise of such sensitive intelligence can have a very significant impact, and it can lead to sometimes the loss of life if we're not cautious with how we handle that intelligence.
Well, bearing that in mind and referring to paragraph 23 of your witness statement, how is the threat to national security best counteracted?
I mean, it's really important, as we've learned in counter-terrorism over the years, and the model for policing has changed in this area so a lot as a result of learning, that we come together and work so closely with members of the intelligence community, sometimes, of course, our international and other partners, to ensure that we're sharing the required levels of information that allow us to make an assessment of that threat and, in turn, the response to that threat.
So information sharing,
yes,
being vitally important, and joint decision-making processes.
Extremely close collaboration that is part of that joint decision-making process that takes place in the JOT and to some extent in ELG.
And I'm not going to ask you for detail, but is it right to say that since 2018, some 6 years ago now, there have been significant developments in the joint working processes between CTP and the Security Service?
Yes, there has very significant developments.
Now, in a counter-terrorism or counter-state threat investigation, we've heard there'll be a senior investigating officer. What is their specific role?
So they are to lead the day-to-day activity within any kind of investigation. So We will frequently see on television a sort of, for example, a murder team investigation with a senior investigating officer that sits above it and directs the day-to-day conduct and strategy of that investigation. There's exactly the same role in counter-terrorism policing. An SIO will lead the day-to-day activity that takes place from a large investigation team. It just so happens in our world, obviously, we work closely with different partners than you might in other parts of policing.
So setting the strategic and tactical objectives of the investigation,
Yep.
managing the day-to-day activities of officers and staff undertaking different roles in the investigation, and ensuring that the team works collaboratively with different agencies. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was the structure of oversight for the senior investigating officer?
So there are several different types of oversight. I've talked about the ELG, the Executive Liaison Group in CT, but one of the others is what we call a PIP4, so professionalising...
What?
A PIP4, so a PIP4, which basically means the Professionalising Investigations Programme, which is a College of Policing programme. So it's about how we train and accredit our senior investigating officers. And a PIP4, so an SIO is referred to, sir, as a PIP3. So they've been through the college training to be an SIO. A PIP4 is that next level, a strategic senior investigating officer who can act as a guide to a senior investigating officer in a complex investigation and also can remove some external influence over the SIO to allow them to run an investigation. So, for example, if there was a significant media presence in an investigation, that strategic SIO, the PIP4, can take the media away and be responsible for delivery of that media, allowing the SIO to focus on the important work to investigate the crime that's happened.
Yes, from what you're saying, the SIO is, as it were, the operational manager of the investigation. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Although they do take strategic leadership of it, sir, and it's only in really complex cases will we have a PIP4 where we feel that extra level of oversight and support is absolutely necessary.
So if I've just got the layers of supervision correct, we start with the PIP3, the senior investigating officer,
Yes.
then the PIP4, who has senior oversight, but also links to other consequence management type issues like
Yes.
media and the issues that we've heard with DCC Mills.
That's correct.
And then we have the senior national coordinator, and then the AXO at the top.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, and in the Salisbury and Amesbury poisonings, we've heard, if I perhaps start from the top and go down again, AXO, Sir Mark Rowley transferring to Neil Bazoo, the senior national coordinator transferring to DOC Hayden.
Correct.
The PIP4, who was that in Salisbury and Amesbury?
So this was a Detective Chief Superintendent from the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit at the time.
And can you tell us, you've talked about the importance of information sharing and collaboration, joint working. With which partners did counter-terrorism police liaise in the Salisbury and Amesbury investigations?
So there were a broad spread of partners obviously engaged in all of our responses to this, but clearly we worked with our intelligence community partners in the way that we normally would. But in addition to which, as you've heard from Mr. Mills earlier today, we worked very closely within our counter-terrorism investigation with the SCG and the response under him as gold for Wiltshire and, of course, consequence management to ensure that the scenes in Salisbury could be returned to normal at some point in the future.
And so how did you ensure information sharing between that parallel response? Was it just through the PIP4? Was there anybody else placed within the SCG or to liaise?
So initially, what would normally happen is the PIP4 acts as a conduit between the strategic coordination group you've heard about today and a counter-terrorism investigation. This was such a large and complex investigation that the decision was taken at a very early stage to deploy a detective superintendent into the SCG who could attend all of the SCG meetings and ensure that there was a two-way communication that existed between the SCG and the investigation. And I took a decision early in the investigation to also send in a forensic expert from SO15 to work in what you heard called the STAC earlier, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Cell. That was part of Mr. Mills's response.
And was that Keith Asman?
No. It was an officer that would report to Keith Asman.
But Keith Asman was the forensic coordinator, is that
He was the forensic coordinator working on behalf of the senior investigating officer from the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit. I apologise. I know I appreciate it's so complex, so if you have any...
This is why we thought we'd have an introductory
Thank you.
session to explain the systems. And how frequent was liaison and collaboration with, for example, the SCG, other departments?
Well, so we would have attended either through the PIP4 or through our nominated superintendent every one of the SCG meetings. We did exchange information. You can understand perhaps having talked about what I've talked about, the challenges of need to know. Sometimes the information exchange from the investigation into SCG might have been slightly different in this case, but having those embedded officers allowed us to make sure that we were across what everybody was doing. So those would take place on an almost daily basis.
And did you liaise with government departments involved in health and science, such as DSTL and PHE?
So throughout this process, we had a very close liaison with DSTL. We were given nominated scientists to work with at DSTL to ensure that when we were taking investigative decisions, we had the science advice from an expert who understood what we were dealing with in Novichok as a
So just to be clear, as part of the evidential investigations, you had direct liaison with the STL, quite separately from the SCG and their scientific public health advice that they would be receiving from DSTL and PHE?
Yes, although there was clearly liaison between the two different teams within DSTL. So you'd have the DSTL reps attending SCG, DSTL reps supporting the investigation, both from the same agency, both understanding where we were headed. But it's important to say as well, we had relationships with Public Health England, who you heard Mr Mills mention earlier, in terms of those broader advisory notes. And as AXO, Mr Basu would attend COBRA meetings, or on occasion Mr Hayden would attend COBRA meetings, where of course SAGE were present and could be involved in those discussions.
And what about the emergency services and local authorities? How would that liaison, if any, work?
So if we had liaison with them directly, it was to do with specific things in relation to scenes, for example, or support that was needed in terms of consequence management. But the majority of that liaison took place within the Gold and SCG, in which we then worked closely with Mr Mills and his team to ensure that engagement took place.
And as a general point, we've heard from DCC Mills that the poisoning of Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley happened while investigations were still ongoing in relation to the Skripals, and there had already been a number of structures set up. And did that assist?
Yes, it did. So we were able, so for example, lots of our team had deployed within counter-terrorism police in terms at least, and in terms of Mr Mills's team, to both of those incidents. And so we were able to establish that reporting structure and also the specialist officers and staff that we would need to respond to these incidents much quicker in the second incident as a result of what we had learned from the first incident.
And finally, on the point of liaison with different agencies, you say in your witness statement, and this is paragraph 76, that support for the Salisbury investigation was offered by the National Crime Agency, the NCA, and from the FBI, the Federal Bureau for Investigation in the States, but that wasn't needed because CTP had sufficient resources and skills. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. We clearly remained very close in liaison terms with both those agencies, but yes, we did not require resources from them to help us.
And that was in relation to Salisbury. What about Amesbury?
I'm not aware of them ever offering in Amesbury, but again, the same applied, really. The same resources that we had in Salisbury were sufficient to deal with the investigation in Amesbury.
We've heard from DCC Mills about the Wiltshire Police response operations to Salisbury and Amesbury, Fairline and Fortis. Could you give us an overview of the CT police operations with Dana, Katerva and Reed, please?
I can. So
29 to 34 is your witness statement if you need to refer to it.
Thank you. So the first operation you mentioned is Operation Wadana. This was the operation name given to counter-terrorism policing Southeast investigation into Sergei and Yulia Skripal's poisoning here in Salisbury. That was a reactive investigation, so an investigation that focuses on responding to crime scenes and victims, speaking to witnesses, checking CCTV, trying to gather as much evidence to identify what happened and where it might have happened. There was a second operation, and my role in that one, as I mentioned earlier, was to support the SIO, Detective Superintendent from the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit, as a critical friend and ensure that the support was provided to that senior investigating officer. The second operation is Operation Caterva. These two operations ran in parallel. Caterva was the operation for which I was the senior investigating officer. This is a covert investigation that seeks to identify those responsible for this incident, in this case, on the basis of the charges Petrov, Bosharov and Fedotov, and work with partners to understand that in a covert sense, how we use intelligence and information to inform our investigation and then conduct an evidence-based inquiry. So that's Wadana is the response to the incident, Caterva is the covert operation into the suspects. And then as soon as CT policing became aware of the cause of Dawn and Charlie's poisoning, clearly we started Operation Reed, which was under a different senior investigating officer, again from the southeast, DCI Murphy, and it was really important that that investigation was led by a separate individual to ensure the conduct of the investigation wasn't dissuaded by some other activity that we'd already undertaken. So we'd like to see that independent SIO take responsibility.
We're going to hear more about that from you tomorrow.
Right.
So although it was a separate SIO giving that element of independence, did you liaise quite closely between your role as the SIO for Caterva and Operation Reed?
Yes, in effect you had the Detective Superintendent of Wadana, me as the SIO for Caterva, and the DCI who was the SIO for Operation Reed, constantly speaking to each other, attending the same meetings, the same JOTs, and sharing information.
So I'm going to just recap that because it is the first time we're sort of going into the detail of those three investigations, which are obviously of critical importance to this inquiry. So with Dana, we have the reactive investigation to the Skripals,
yes,
for which your role is a critical friend to the SIO.
Yes.
And that's incident-led, so focusing on gathering all the evidence, door-to-door inquiries, scene searches, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Caterva, the parallel investigation into the suspects for which you're the SIO, is a proactive investigation led by intelligence, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's the one in which you particularly work with intelligence partners.
Yes.
And then we have Operation Reed, which is another reactive investigation to Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley's poisoning.
Yes, correct.
For which we've heard that the SIO was DCI Murphy, but with whom you liaised, as did the SIO for Wadana.
Yes, important to say, the same PIP 4 sat above all three of those operations as well. So in order to ensure that coordination, the Chief Superintendent from the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit acted as PIP 4 across all three investigations.
Thank you. That brings us on now to asking you about the scale and complexity of these investigations. Perhaps you could indicate, and you deal with it at paragraphs 33 and 34, the factors that made this particularly challenging.
Well, so this was the first identified use of a chemical weapon in the UK in this case, in this sense, used as a tool, we say, to conduct an assassination in this style. Having worked on the Litvinenko investigation, I understood quite quickly how significant this would be and how completely challenging it would be. So from even our scene investigations through to how we would work with partners to understand who might be responsible for it, the scale of the incident, the impact on the public of Salisbury. This really was an unprecedented investigation, not one that we had seen before, but one that we were able to apply our existing operational processes to in order to respond.
Because the impacts were multiple, weren't they?
So not just on Salisbury, but there was very significant impact on international relations there as well. You will have seen, and I'm sure we will discuss further, the impact on decisions taken by other governments and the impact that using a chemical weapon has on the streets of of anywhere in any country amongst our allies as well. But of course, more broadly, you saw the impact in Salisbury. The world's media were here all of the time, reporting everyday activity that was taking place here. And on top of that, clearly there was a very large coordinated response on behalf of Her Majesty's government at the time. And in addition to that, clearly we had the Russian state commenting in the media, but also making inquiries of us on a regular basis.
So particular challenges conducting an investigation where there's involvements suspected of a hostile state. You've mentioned the media. It's important, isn't it, for the police to be operationally independent?
It's extremely important, yes. We must be able to work without that external influence, unless, of course, that influence is helpful to our investigation. So, yes, what we sort of guard our operational independence very closely in incidents like this, where we will listen to what's happening in the world. We'll listen absolutely to the challenges that are happening, but we need to focus on the evidence that's in front of us, the information available to us that helps inform our prioritisation of actions in an investigation.
And you've mentioned the broader impacts, of course, on the people of Salisbury and Amesbury and the country more broadly, but also there were individual impacts, weren't there, of course, on those contaminated and very tragically in Dawn Sturgess's case, the fatal impact.
Absolutely.
And was there also a twin focus on protecting the public from harm as well as trying to find those responsible and trying to achieve justice?
This was an overriding principle of all of our investigations, actually, is how do we identify the ongoing risk to the public, even in those early stages in the first incident here in Salisbury, and take steps to make sure that while we gather evidence that's important to our criminal investigation, and we're doing that with a primary focus on what does it mean to public health, what does it mean to the health of officers and staff who are deploying into these really challenging, contaminated scenes on a daily basis. So the safety and well-being of the public and our officers and staff were paramount throughout our investigation.
And I think we'll hear more about, particularly when you're dealing with a nerve agent, the practical implications that had for officers who were searching and investigating,
yes,
seeking evidence. One of the questions the family of Dawn Sturgess, those poisoned by the Novichok, the people of Salisbury and the wider public will, of course, ask is, was MI5 involved in the investigations? And you've already, in your evidence, indicated that counter-terrorism policing works closely with MI5, particularly through ELGs and JOTs, and that they, in turn, work with MI6 and GCHQ. So I'd now like to adduce, if I may, please, through Commander Murphy, a witness statement which has been provided by MI5 to the inquiry. If we could have that up on screen, please. It's INQ 006055. This is a 4-page witness statement of MD 39, who is a senior officer within the security service, dated the 2nd of October. The witness starts at paragraph 2 by offering condolences, both on my own behalf and on behalf of MI5 to Ms. Sturgess's family and to all those who have been otherwise affected by the awful events in 2018. Introducing themselves at paragraph 3, the witness explains they've worked for MI5 since 1999. They say, I am currently a senior leader within MI5's counter-state threats branch, and that they've undertaken a wide variety of roles, including in working in counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations and operations. In the same paragraph, MD 39 says they were not involved in the events, but the witness is well placed to provide the statement on behalf of MI5, given their current and previous roles and my previous experience of functions and operation of MI5 generally. At paragraph 4, MD 39 confirms that the purpose of the statement is to address the nature and extent of MI5's investigation into the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal and latterly Ms. Sturgess and its liaison with the parallel police investigations. As I addressed with you in relation to your own evidence, Commander Murphy, MD 39 says at paragraph 5 that they have sought to be as transparent as possible, but I must emphasise at the outset that there remains a level of detail that I cannot address without risking serious harm to national security. And MD 39 in that paragraph goes on to explain the reasons for that. Commander Murphy, is that a balance that you well understand?
Yes, absolutely.
Paragraph 7, MD 39, confirms, however, that MI5 has made available to the Chair and his legal team everything they've sought to review, and that the inquiry will therefore be able to investigate all the matters it covers in closed where it cannot do so in open. At paragraphs 8 to 11, MI5 sets out its legal powers and remit, which includes the protection of national security, and in particular its protection against threats from espionage, terrorism and sabotage from the activities of agents of foreign powers. And at paragraph 10, MD 39 explains that MI5's history of effort against the Russian Federation and former Soviet Union means it has built and maintained significant experience in the investigation of the activities of the Russian state today. Commander Murphy, I'd like you to confirm for us your understanding and experience of what's set out at paragraph 11 in terms of the division of powers and roles as between MI5 and the police.
Yes, thank you. So in paragraph 11, the witness refers to MI5 not having powers of arrest, for example. How it tends to work in reality is that in the intelligence phase of an operation, so it will be MI5 led, and then as we transition into disrupting some activity, it will become police led and supported by MI5. That transition is largely what's being referred to here by the witness, where they work closely with other law enforcement partners to ensure that once there's a need for action based upon that intelligence, they know who to come to see that action.
So for members of the public in particular who may not be familiar with the respective powers, the police have powers of arrest.
Yes.
And conduct criminal investigations with a view to prosecution.
Yes.
MI5 provides police and law enforcement with information and intelligence assessments on threats, but each collaborates with the other on investigations that may result in criminal proceedings. Does that
Absolutely
summarise
correct.
it?
Yes.
Moving on to section C of the statement, MI5's investigation. At paragraph 13, MI5 confirms MI5 carried out a full investigation into the incident in Salisbury and those within the Russian intelligence services responsible for it. Although the police and MI5 have distinct roles and responsibilities, MI5 works together with the police to achieve the objectives of a post-incident investigation. This partnership model was adopted for the post-incident investigation into the events in Salisbury, and then after Ms. Sturgess tragically fell ill and died, the same model was adopted. Commander Murphy, can you confirm that there was indeed a covert investigation from your knowledge?
I can, yes.
And at paragraph 14, MD 39 gives slightly more information about what the police did and what MI5 did in this particular case. The police led on ensuring public safety, the prevention of further attacks, evidence gathering to support executive action, and ensuring public confidence and reassurance, including delivering public communications in relation to the incident. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that's correct.
MI5 led on the gathering and exploitation, assessment and dissemination of intelligence to support the post-incident investigation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so does that sum up the partnership model and the respective roles and responsibilities that you experienced during the investigations into these events?
Thank you. Yes, it does.
At the end of paragraph 14, MD 39 indicated that while a large proportion of the investigation involved covert activities and collection of intelligence, some simultaneous overt activities were conducted by the police, including large-scale CCTV retrieval and public appeals for assistance. Again, is that right?
Yes, that's right. In essence, that is us sharing information from our investigative activity back with MI5 to ensure that we've got that two-way sharing to make joint assessments of what we do next.
Thank you. That brings me to my final point about police techniques and evidential sources. Your witness statement contains reference to a very large number of techniques and evidential sources which appear to have been exploited by the police in the investigations. I'm going to list them and then ask you to confirm whether that list properly represents the range of police techniques that were considered or deployed and the evidential sources that were used in the investigations. So you refer to house-to-house inquiries.
Where are you, please, Ms. Martin?
In fact, because I am all over the statement,
All right, no, that's fine.
I'm going to list the types of inquiries and evidential sources.
In that case,
and no doubt Commander Murphy will let me know if I've missed any or if any are incorrect. So house-to-house inquiries. But so I do have some paragraph references for your reference. I'll just indicate as we go. Is 103. Scene searches and forensic investigations.
Yes.
Building victim profiles, Sir, paragraph 36. Reviewing digital devices, paragraph 38. Police interviews with victims, paragraph 103.
Correct.
Sorry, what was the last one?
Police interviews with victims.
Oh, yes, right.
103. Developing working hypotheses.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the development of sequence of events and timelines through scene investigations.
Absolutely.
So paragraphs 63 to 66. Witness interviews. Communications data.
Yes.
Police intelligence. The last three, sir, are paragraphs 63 to 66. CCTV, paragraph 84. Yes. Outside inquiries, for example, financial investigations and witness trawls.
Correct.
That's paragraph 84. Automatic number plate recognition inquiries, paragraph 90. Reviewing information from other police forces, officers, Wiltshire Police in this case. Sampling, paragraph 90.
Yep.
CBRN policing techniques.
Correct.
Paragraph 101. Wi-Fi checks and cell site data, paragraph 103. Conventional biometric swabbing fingerprints, and in the context you describe it at paragraph 122, you say that was considered.
Yes.
So are there times when those biometrics actually are not suitable?
Yes, absolutely. For example, depending upon the circumstances of each individual scene, it may be not appropriate to take fingerprints and DNA from those scenes.
Scene walkthroughs, paragraph 125 to 126.
Correct.
And media articles, paragraph 199.
Yes.
And does that properly represent the sort of range of policing techniques that were considered or deployed and the evidential sources?
Just on that last point, I think on media articles it's much broader than that as well. Clearly it is all material that might be posted open source that may well provide some useful information to us. So
that's researching open source material.
Absolutely, sir. Not just media, but more broadly.
In other words, you can look up online just the same as anybody else can.
Exactly.
Right.
And presumably when there's open source media research, police would also seek to establish in parallel other evidential support for anything they might find in.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean these things posted online are sometimes not the strength of evidence that we would like to see. So of course we parallel everything in an investigative sense.
Yeah.
And on that note, was disinformation something that had to be taken into consideration, particularly in this case?
Yes.
Can you just explain that?
So there was an awful lot of information posted online, but also there were a number of journalistic and other agencies out there that were conducting their own inquiries and investigations, so huge amounts of information online. And some of that obviously was reviewed by us so that we could understand whether or not it provided us with an investigative opportunity that we might explore further.
Thank you, Commander Murphy. That concludes my questioning for this tranche of evidence. As we've said, you're due to return tomorrow to address Operation Reed, the investigation into the poisoning of Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley that you've described.
Yes.
Sir, it is a shorter day today, but we have extremely full days for the rest of the week. So it may be that all of the teams, and you so yourself, will find it useful to have some time for discussions and to undertake further preparatory
No, I think
work
even I
about
understand that there's a good deal of work done outside the courtroom, Ms. Whitelaw. Mr. Murphy, I gather you're going to be coming back from time to time to, as it were, deal with particular compartments of evidence. Please feel free to go now. If you need to confer with counsel in relation to evidence which is yet to come, please feel free to do that.
Thanks, sir.
But not, please, as it were, to rehash what you've just told us. What you've just told us stands as your evidence.
Sir, thank you.
All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Miss Whitelaw, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?
Thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow morning.